Hello and good day. My name is Jonathan Bagger. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the American Physical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Annual Leadership Meeting. The ALM is an important time for us to examine the challenges and opportunities facing the physics community as we look towards the year ahead. When I became CEO just over a year ago, we held great hope that life would return to normal when the COVID-19 vaccines became available. But as we now know, the virus had other plans. Nevertheless, I believe that over this past year, the pandemic has enabled APS to go stronger and more resilient because of all that we have experienced together. We are now in position to build an even better future, one in which APS is more inclusive, effective, and sustainable than it ever was before. And for that, I am grateful. A case in point is the speed with which our staff turned this meeting from being hybrid to fully virtual. I'd like to call out Courtney Bauger and Hunter Clemens and their teams for their incredible work. Thank you for making this meeting possible. I'm happy that the virtual meeting platform is allowing physicists from across the globe to participate in this meeting. You will hear from some of them today. In fact, we are taking steps to ensure that in the future, all APS meetings will be hybrid, assuring that physicists worldwide can be part of our community. This is being done to support the American Physical Society's mission to advance and diffuse the knowledge of physics for the benefit of humanity, no matter where on the planet one lives. I cannot think of a better and more appropriate mission for our society. And now, I am pleased to introduce the 2022 APS President, Frances Helmut, who will offer her introduction. Frances is a condensed matter experimentalist at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the former Dean of the Division of Mathematical and Physical Sciences at Berkeley and a member of the scientific staff at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an APS Fellow, and a member of the LIGO Gravitational Wave Collaboration. Frances, over to you.
Thanks, John. And I am delighted to join you all today as the APS president and to welcome you to the annual leadership meeting. I echo John's sentiments that we were hopeful for an in-person meeting, but as is obvious, we've decided the safest option for our volunteers, members, staff, and the Washington, D.C. community would be to host this meeting virtually. As we've navigated through the challenges created by the pandemic, APS has become more and more familiar with virtual and hybrid meetings. Virtual meetings like this one enable physicists across the globe to join in the conversation. The APS annual leadership meeting seeks to bring to the forefront the ways that we as a physics community can advance and diffuse the knowledge of and excitement in physics and ensure that all who want to practice physics find a welcoming and supportive environment. As chair of the 2022 annual leadership meeting, I'm really excited to join you to hear the panel discussions today. The topics today explore issues facing the scientific community today, where APS is actively engaged: research security concerns, misinformation, global scientific challenges, and broadening our community. APS strongly supports the exchange of information. However, national security concerns have led to US federal policies that restrict who can participate in certain areas of US-based research and limit US-based researchers' ability to engage in international activities. Today, we will hear perspectives on research security from the federal science agencies, industry, national labs, and universities. From climate change denialism to vaccine hesitancy, over just the last year, we've seen the devastating effects that misinformation can have on the planet and on our everyday life. Our speakers in that session will focus on the extent, causes, and impact of scientific information and what might be done to counter these issues. Third panel, The critical issues facing our society and planet will require global cooperation, but there are limiting factors that impede this process. We will hear today in the third panel from leaders from around the world on their perspectives of the challenges and opportunities to address these global scientific issues. Finally, we will turn our attention in the fourth panel to broadening our vision of who does physics, what physics is, and why we do physics. Students come to the discipline with a wide variety of goals, aspirations, and personal backgrounds that are all essential physics and key in addressing the many issues that we discussed today. After that, this evening, after the panel discussions are concluded, I hope you will join me in congratulating 3 exceptional scientists on their achievements. The recipients of the APS Medal, the Lilienfeld Prize, and the Valley Prize will be honored with a mini documentary on their life and work and make remarks during the awards ceremony. Many, many thanks to the speakers and moderators for sharing their time and expertise with us on these important topics. And finally, thanks again, once again, to all of you for joining us here today. So we'll be back in just a minute with the first panel, Partnering on Research Security. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this year's panel on Partnering on Research Security at the APS Annual Leadership Meeting. I'm Phil Bucksbaum, professor at Stanford and SLAC, and the 2020 president of APS. Research security is our leadoff topic for this annual leadership meeting, and that's true in part because it's one of the leading issues in our research community for the past 2 years or more. So let me try to set the stage for what we're going to discuss today. At our annual leadership meeting back in 2000, we held panels on international cooperation and competition and research security. And a shadow over that meeting was recent arrests of leading American scientists charged with hiding their ties to Chinese research and thereby jeopardizing US security. The Department of Justice started its China initiative to root out non-traditional espionage from China. Sometimes the charges proved groundless and were later dropped, as in the case of Temple physicist Professor Xiaosheng Shi, but not before Professor Shi's life and career had been seriously disrupted. So here we are in 2022, and the issue has grown. There have been some convictions, but others have had experiences like Xiaosheng Shi, arrested, research disrupted, sometimes terminated, and then the charges dropped or thrown out of court, including just this week, the dropping of all charges against arrested MIT professor Gang Chen. You know, this affects all of us. The White House has ordered the funding agencies to tighten research security among their grantees, and they've also tightened student visa policies out of concern that foreign spy agencies could be recruiting students and young scientists. And recent studies of our own members conducted by the APS are showing that international students are starting to choose not to come to the US to study because the atmosphere is no longer as welcoming as it once was. Now, our community has reacted to all of this with bewilderment, anger, and with quite a bit of fear. And as scientists, we know that international contact and international students are both essential for progress, and they're more important now than ever. We also know that scientific progress and international leadership by US scientists has always involved a partnership between us, the scientists, our universities, and the federal government, which has both sponsored our research, but also protected our freedom to disseminate our unclassified work. So to help us all understand what's at stake here and how we might reestablish a stronger partnership and how our work will be affected in the future, the APS has brought together an expert panel on international research and security this morning. I'd like to welcome our panelists to discuss these issues. I'll give you some brief information about each of them first as we get started. Helena Fu is one of our panelists. She's the director of the Office of International Science and Technology Cooperation and Trusted Research in the Department of Energy Office of Science. Welcome, Helena. Prior to that, she served at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she co-chaired the National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Research Security. She's no stranger to China. She worked at the US Embassy in Beijing from 2012 to 2018. I'd also like to welcome Rebecca Keiser. Rebecca is the head of the Office of International Science and Engineering at the National Science Foundation. And she's also the inaugural holder of a new position, the position of Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, a mouthful, at the Science Foundation. This position was established in March 2020 to ensure the security of federally funded research while maintaining open international collaborations. In that role, Rebecca provides the National Science Foundation director with policy advice on all aspects of research security strategy. She also leads the NSF's efforts to develop and implement efforts to improve research security and the agency's coordination with other federal agencies and the White House. Our next panelist is J. Michael McQuade. Mike is special advisor to the president of Carnegie Mellon University, providing strategic advice on the university's research enterprise and advocating for the role of, that science, technology, and innovation play nationally and globally. He's previously served as the vice president for research at Carnegie Mellon. Prior to that, he worked in industry. He was senior vice president for science and technology at United Technologies Corporation. Our next panelist is Dario Gil. Dario is senior vice president of IBM, and he's the director of IBM Research. He's a leader in the emerging quantum computing industry, and he's also a strong advocate for collaborative research. Dario co-chairs the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab, Artificial Intelligence Lab, which advances fundamental artificial intelligence research to the broad benefit of industry and society. And he also co-chairs the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium, which has provided access to the world's most powerful high-performance computing resources to support COVID-19 research. Finally, I'd like to welcome Helmut Dosch. Helmut chairs the board of directors of DESY, basically the director of the German synchrotron DESY. This is an international user facility located in Hamburg. Prior to 2009, he was the director of the Max Planck Institute for metal research in Stuttgart. He's internationally recognized for his work on surface melting of ice and on critical phenomena at alloy interfaces. So thank you all for joining us. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. And Helena, perhaps I could start by asking you, in your view, you're at DOE, and so you've been very much in the middle of the research security issues that have affected people who get grant money and have contracts from DOE. So I'd like to start by asking what your view is on what's new. What are the growing research security threats, and what's really changed to create the need now to step up our research security at the agencies?
Thanks so much. And I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be here today. And also thanks to our FBI colleague, Patrick, for his briefing just now. I would just want to start with saying that even though this session is titled Research Security, really want to lead off with the importance of both the openness and research security, and that these concepts are really not diametrically opposed and that they're mutually reinforcing. And I really appreciated your recent report, which emphasizes the importance of that open exchange of information. As you know, for DOE, we're not strangers to international collaborations. We see them as essential to our success in advancing the frontiers of science, whether through projects like LBNF Dune, or our participation in the Large Hadron Collider, or our future electron ion. These are things that will involve thousands of researchers from institutions all around the world. So the question around, what is the risk from an agency perspective? Frankly, I would say Patrick laid out many of the risks that they're seeing, and we are in very close contact with the security agencies on some of these concerns. And I would really just point to the release of NSPM 33 as the overarching framework through which we see some of these concerns and how we hope to address them. I would say, from when I was a co-chair at OSTP, along with Rebecca and NIH and DOE at the time, the overarching framework and the importance of the openness and the research security were never far from our minds. And what was really heartening to me was that we went through this entire process in the last administration. It was released last year, and that the new administration also took it up and recognized that importance of both of these topics and recognized the importance of really moving forward in a consistent and coordinated way. So now that I'm back at the agency, now starts the hard work of actually implementing this policy. And that's really where the rubber will meet the road. It will really be where we need to make decisions. We need to decide where these gaps are and how we're going to address them. And it will need to be informed by these overarching principles that were laid out in the implementation guidance. And I would say, there are three very clear directives that we've received from OSTP, really around how we can protect America's security and openness, how we can be clear so that researchers can easily and properly comply, and how we ensure that these policies don't fuel xenophobia or prejudice. And these are three things that we're going to be keeping top of mind as we move forward. It's not going to be easy. That is definitely 100% for sure. But I would just say, hearkening again to the title of this particular panel, that's why we're having this conversation now, so that we can hear, as we have in the past, from APS and from others in the community, to really hear how our policies are being interpreted, how our messaging is being interpreted, and find a way to actually work together to address these issues together.
Well, thanks very much for bringing that up. You started out by actually talking a little bit about the international perspective, and we're definitely going to come back to that. But I'd like to bring in Rebecca right now, because you two have been very much leading your respective agencies and working together on implementing. Now, a couple of times this has been mentioned, and I should just play the good role of a moderator and point out, what is this NSPM 33? NSPM 33 is a National Security Presidential Memorandum. It came out in early 2020, and it has been updated, clarified, modified a bit. But the main idea is to direct all of the federal agencies that fund science and technology to work together on uniform approach to research security. It sounds very broad, and it is. And it is just now, much later, I guess it was 21 that it reached. So it's only been 1 year, right? Said 2020. It's just now, a year later, getting to the point where some of us are beginning to see the effects on our grant applications and paperwork. And so, Rebecca, maybe I could bring you in to give your perspective from the National Science Foundation about how these changes are affecting the scientists who rely on funding from the agencies.
Sure, thanks, Phil. My title is so long that we use the acronym CRISP, and so I hope that helps. I've also transitioned from the head of the Office of International Science and Engineering to focus on the research security role. For the reasons that we said before, we want to be very clear that international collaboration is encouraged, and that international collaboration is not this related to these issues of research security. So let me talk a little bit about implementation of this NSPM, yet another acronym here, and what we're doing. There are 4 sections in the implementation guidance that we're working on very, very diligently. The first is, as you said, Phil, the harmonization of disclosure requirements. That's something that we're very committed to doing. I think the implementation guidance has a very helpful table in it that describes what needs to be disclosed in what section. And this is harmonized across agencies. NSF has had disclosure requirements for quite a while. As you know, in recent years, we've been working hard to be as clear as possible, both about those requirements and also about how we use the information that is provided to us. A next step that we're going to be doing for the implementation guidance through the NSTC Research Security Subcommittee is setting up a centralized place for the public to see how all of us as funding agencies use the information that's disclosed to us, so that it's very clear. And it's also very clear about why we do require this information to be provided. The second is work on a harmonized format for that disclosure. And NSF and NIH have started on that process. We use Science CV for the disclosure of the biosketch and the current and pending support information. And we'll be coordinating across funding agencies on that common format. The third thing is the digital persistent identifier. And this is an identifier that is associated with the researcher and moves with the researcher from institution to institution. This is going to be very helpful, we think, in making sure that we're all clear about giving credit to the right people for doing the research and also being able to follow up on disclosure information. As you know, many societies have already talked about adapting a digital persistent identifier because it also helps make sure that we, again, can follow the publications that researchers have and see who cites those publications and make sure that we give credit to the right people. We think that this is something that's going to be very helpful overall. But the devil's in the details, and we want to make sure that as funding agencies, we have a digital persistent identifier set of standards that are interoperable so that one researcher doesn't feel confused that they have to get a different DPI to apply to different agencies. So that's going to be work that's happening. And the last thing I'll mention is this research security program requirement. The NSPM 33 says that a research organization receiving $50 million or more in federal funding needs to establish a research security program, and it has in the implementation guidance the different elements that that program will have as part of it. We know that we need to provide technical assistance to institutions for the establishment of this program. So NSF, NIH, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and FBI, we're all partnering to develop a research security training modules that will be widely available to the community to use. And so there'll be more about that coming out in the future. The last thing I want to say is I want to express my own appreciation to the academic community. Universities have truly stepped up regarding identifying and resolving potential conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment and tightening disclosure requirements. That's been extremely, extremely helpful to us. I think I get a call from a university representative almost every day telling me about the different actions that are being taken to best make a system that's more effective and efficient. And that's something that is just wonderful because we do have to all work in partnership on these issues to make sure that we approach them fairly, equitably, that we differentiate between this and international collaboration and encourage collaboration, and make sure that we're not overly burdening the research community. What I would love for us to do is get beyond compliance into a point where we're all focusing together on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And before we move on to talk about international and the effects on universities, while I have, while we're on this topic of the agency response, I wonder if we could pick up a thread that was also alluded to by Patrick, and that is that in some cases, say, for example, disclosure requirements to the agencies, non-compliance should be a matter that can be, at least in some cases, treated by the agencies. And I'm thinking about not just the carrot but the stick here. That is, what are you thinking about, or what is there? Where is there guidance that we as researchers can go look at about the penalties?
So there is what I hope is a helpful section of the implementation guidance that talks about potential consequences for violations, and also the factors that go into determining the consequences, as well as potential mitigating factors that might cause us to have a much less severe administrative action put into place, or maybe work out something else other than administrative actions. So I hope that that's very helpful. I think we do look at administrative action very judiciously, and by that I mean debarments and suspensions and terminations of awards. Our Office of Inspector General goes through an extensive process of investigation. It takes months and months and months. They present the case to us with their recommendation on what we should do. We deeply consider it before we take that action. And so I hope that that careful process and the clarity that we're hoping is provided in the implementation guidance will assist us all in understanding these issues. Thanks.
Okay, and Helena.
Yeah, I would just add
Oh,
no worries. on that piece, some of those examples in terms of the factors that we would consider are things like what the harm or potential harm to the federal government or national interests, the intent or pattern of violation versus an isolated incident. And so there's a complete list in the implementation guidance, but I think those are the types of things that we might look at. The other thing that I would just flag is that there is also a provision in the guidance around information sharing within the federal government about violations of disclosure requirements. And that is going to be another stream of work within the subcommittee on how we do that in a way that is consistent with due process and privacy concerns. But that will be another stream of work in the coming few months.
Yeah, thank you both for addressing that. We all are trying to do the right thing and mostly talking about doing the right thing, but we need to touch on the consequences too. So I'd like to turn the conversation back, though, to something that both of you mentioned, and that is the importance of international science, international cooperation. It's something that's kind of driving all this, and bring into the conversation Dario Gil, the director of IBM Research. Thank you so much, Dario, for being here today. IBM Research is international. I mean, unlike the Department of Energy, your laboratories are all over the world, people going back and forth. So how do you see these risks to research security from a global perspective?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And as you correctly pointed out, it's our first name, right? International Business Machines, IBM, right? Since 110 years doing information technology, and by necessity, we operate around the world. So a couple of comments I'd like to make. First, on the industry approach to security and securing R&D. I'd like to also say a few words on international collaborations, and also on the topic of exports as a regulatory mechanism, right, to enforce, and the good things and the perils of it. So the first thing I would say from an industry perspective is that securing R&D is about securing a competitive advantage, right? So we've talked about in the context of sort of like the negative aspect of like, well, not negative, but like, what happens when you over-enforce and the challenges with it. But, framing it also as what is the basis of competition and what is the basis for that security is very important within an industrial context. And just to give a couple of examples, in terms of designing a program, and I'll give an example on quantum computing, right, to just bring something concrete on the table. Is the wrong framing to say, is that open or is it closed, right? But rather, to have a much more fine-grained approach to that topic of security. You will go from, so for example, we treat quantum computing in IBM as a crown jewel that has a special significance and meaning inside the company, that has everything from additional security measures, from physical security, to how we treat it from a cybersecurity perspective, to even how we treat IP. Is quantum computing IP part of cross-license agreements of IBM or not? So for example, we exclude them out, right? So there's a tier approach around this. And also on this fine grain, rather this open versus close, you look at it as a full stack view. You say, okay, what aspects of it are so sensitive, they're gonna be a trade secret, right? Not even patented. What should be patented? What should be licensed? What should be published? What should be open? Right, in terms of open source, and then when the things are the most sensitive, you even approach things like compartments and how you separate it. So FAIR is like that perspective that I think is very important, a fine-grained approach to security, and avoid sort of this duality of like it's either this or that. Second, briefly to touch on international collaborations. Right, I think this is extremely important to recognize that the basis of U.S. standard of living and strength, it's our ability to engage internationally, right? And to benefit from the extraordinary talented that is around the world, and for the United States to remain a beacon of attracting the best people from around the world, and to collaborate with partners around the world. So on that aspect, I think on the tone of the whole discussion around security, while being exquisitely aware of all the challenges we confront and what we have to do to be about this, to say it again and again, that international engagement and partnership, it's a source of the strength of the nation, right? And to be unwavering on that. And lastly, I'll touch on the topic of export controls as an illustration. We could talk in a different context of classification, et cetera, but just on export control for a minute, a couple of points that I think are important. They have to be designed to protect, not slow down, the pace of progress of US industry. And this is the dual goal that we must achieve. And I think that this balance between economic vitality and growth and national security, and drawing that line accurately, is of the utmost importance. So, for example, the imposition of impractical export controls or poorly crafted policies really hinders the commercialization and development of emerging technologies. And really what they do is they proliferate the enablement of components by adversaries, right? Or reduce market access by US businesses and restrict the freedom to operate. So really we need to improve as a country, I think, in having a simple and more expedited path for how we resolve these tensions in a faster fashion. As an illustration around that, and we could talk about classification and over-classification as another challenge. But let me stop there as a first set of comments.
Oh, well, thank you very much for those comments. There's really a lot to chew on there, but let me just follow up by asking, it sounds like you would say that we're not yet there with respect to the question of how are we doing to accomplish this protect but not slow down paradigm for emerging technologies.
I agree, and I worry about actions that are already present, and I worry about unintended or bad decision making of things that are often on the table and being threatened to be imposed. So averting bad decisions, right, is very important. And at any given time, as we know, for all of us who are very involved both in industry and government and so on, there are lots of things on the table at any given time that causes one, sometimes, a lot of enthusiasm, and some of them a lot of concern. And definitely I have my long list of things that I have a big concern if we make the wrong decisions. And that's why this discussion is so important, because setting the tone and the balance of what is the objective we're trying to do is crucially important. Because if we have a very narrow mindset about what it does, what you can do is you achieve one narrow objective, but you destroy the whole industry for the United States. And then we all agree that that's catastrophic, because the wealth and the success of the nation is dependent on our ability to be successful on that front.
Yeah, thanks so much for those comments. That I think a lot of this hinges on people. I'd like to bring in Helmut Dosch at this point. Helmut, you're the director of DESY. DESY and is one of only a handful of real crown jewel laboratories around the world that do things that, and for researchers that they cannot do in any other way than to go to your laboratories. And as a result, you have open international policies for the synchrotron and also for the free electron lasers that are on the DESY site. So how do you approach this new emphasis, which is largely nation-based on research security with respect to having completely open doors at the International User Facility?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Also, I'm delighted to be on this panel. So as Phil said, indeed, we are a national lab in Germany. We have around about 3,000 employees, and we are working on, very fundamental things, exploration of matter with large-scale accelerator facilities. So we entertain, we are 60 years old, and we have been entertaining many strategic international collaborations all over the world, and so developing and maintaining healthy collaborations with very different partner organizations is actually our daily business. So it was mentioned by many other people, there is no alternative to continuing with international corporations. We have essentially three reasons. The one is a financial thing, so the financial efforts in many of our areas now exceed the possibility of a single lab, even of a single country. Particle physics is a typical example for that, where we are also involved. But there's also the complexity of a given problem, which requires international cooperation of the best minds. So there are many examples, and Phil, you mentioned the free electron lasers, where many new concepts have to be developed, and here you need really the cooperation of the best brains. But there's another challenge now, which is becoming more and more global. This is as we all now experience climate change and pandemics, and the BioNTech Keiser collaboration is maybe the most wonderful story we have to tell now, how international collaboration can actually rescue lives, millions of lives. And I'm really anxious to see the panel of our convener, John Bagger. He is investigating the areas of international collaboration. So I want to say, so I was listening to Helena and also to Rebecca. So I don't know what you have, but in Germany we have a Freedom of Science Act, which is very robustly fixed in Article 5.3 of our Federal Basic Law, which grants to scientists the freedom to choose any research topic, the freedom to choose any international partner, the freedom to choose all appropriate forms of cooperation, and the freedom to use the results of research for scientific purposes. So this is the basis, and on this basis also DESY works, but it's very clear that the name of the game today is how can we continue to cooperate internationally in science in a politically increasingly complicated world. The question is actually not new to us. So I remind you to the times of the Cold War, where the polarity was not between US and China, but US with the Soviet Union at that time. And I can tell you that DESY has entertained many, unofficial, official contacts and cooperations with laboratories in the former Soviet Union. And we got many interesting informations out of the system, which were also very important also for policymakers. So to maintain cooperations is a scientific cooperations, I think is a very juicy element we have to maintain sort of a line of language between different areas. So we have many things implemented nonetheless in our lab in the last years in order to create more robustness of our lab. So we have education system of our scientists that they get aware of possible risks. We have, very importantly, continuous discussions with trusted organizations in different areas of the world, in China, in Russia, in India, in the BRIC states. We have because I'm a member of the Helmut Association, we have established foreign offices in Moscow, in Beijing, and other places, which are important pillars for us because they can give us, inside information, and could do also vetting of what we are planning and so on. So we have, of course, as many of you also have in your labs, now an export control officer, which, as Dario also said, is not, making our lives difficult, but is enabling us, to robustly cooperate. The control officer is essentially lining us up in the legal frame of cooperation. It's not political, it's the legal path. What can we do and what we do? And he tells us, if you do that, that's illegal and you could put into jail. So, but this is what he does. And we have now for future projects, and this is new, and we have not, but there's a plan that we do project-directed dual-use research of concern committees. We had one famous case in the last years. This is free electron laser science. This is science with lasers which work with high-power accelerators, and they produce X-ray light with laser quality. So this is one of these areas, where we need cooperation with international partners, and China, US is a premium partner here for us, but also China is far, far beyond, copy-paste what the Western world does. They really have, developed really a premium knowledge and are interesting cooperation partners. So, so I give you an example of what we did. So when we started a cooperation with China, so there was, several lamps lighted up in the offices of intelligence. I'm pretty sure that this was lighting also up in Patrick's office when we went into free electron lasers, because this field of research was launched in the US in the 80s during Ronald Reagan as a part of the SDI initiative. And free electron lasers were mentioned there as energy-directed weapons. So, so in the meantime, of course, decades have passed, and the free electron lasers are in operation worldwide, being built, and also in many countries, also in Asia. So this vision of an energy-directed weapon has never been realized, but the red alert status in these various offices, foreign office and intelligence offices, has never been updated. So in order to create here better transparency, so we organized actually an international conference on free electron laser dual use. It was, I think, in 2018. And this was attended, interestingly, by the most competent representatives from all over the world, also from US, Los Alamos. And the conference actually was held under the Chatham House rules, which actually has led to a very, very open atmosphere of exchange. The results have been published after approval by all parties involved, and they are available to everybody on the internet. So they provide now a new robust scientific basis for determining which FEL research is clearly of civil use in nature, which is clearly military, there are some, and which is this famous gray area that needs to be watched very carefully, this dual use area. And we have collected numerous recommendations how to set up international cooperation and to control the dual use gray area, as for example, by setting up a dual use research of concern committee and many, many other things. So what do I want to say with this? I think So if we are swallowed too much by this risk, there is a danger, and this is also what Dario said, a danger that we are removing further and further away from international cooperation and getting more and more national. And I think this would be devastating, not only for science, but also for the development of science in a country like the US, but it's also devastating for the development of the whole civil situation in the world. So, DESY is in Europe, and Europe has a difficult neighborhood. So we have in the south, we have Africa. In the east, we have the Middle East. Further east, we are directly in the Kremlin. On the north, we are with Boris Johnson. So we have a complex environment. So and also science has a role, maintain a diplomatic role. So therefore, the situation in my lab is not completely different what you are discussing, but so the boundary conditions are certainly different. So as Helena is watching and listening to me now, we are working with Asia, but we are working very closely also and extremely successfully also with SLAC, with Argonne, and many other laboratories. And it's a wonderful experience and has brought a win-win situation to all the different labs. But I notice now that with this new worries around the world, that US sees DESY in a collaboration with national labs in US. And they also see us in a collaboration with Asia. So it's a triangle situation. And also in a private life, a triangle situation is difficult to handle. But this is also here extremely difficult. So therefore, it would be very advisable if so I talk about US, Germany, Europe, develop a better understanding what we want. This is not meant to be as closing us up against Asia, but I think opening us up better. So to get away from this triangle situation, US, Europe, Asia, China, to a more bilateral thing, US and Europe, and then develop joint strategy with the Asian continent, particularly with China and Russia, would be extremely helpful. So we have launched, maybe Phil, this conference on the transatlantic big science, which is held in Washington this year in fall, end of October, beginning of November, exactly also to make our cooperation more robust, and that we are entering into a better understanding what we want together, and then see how we open up and how we do it with the Asian partners. That's all for the moment.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to chew on in your comments, and I think we'll come back to a few things. But one thing that I would like to actually bring in Mike McQuade to comment on is this issue been brought up now a few times, first by Dario, I think, on it's not just open versus closed, but there are gray areas. Of course, those of us in research in the US know about Department of Commerce export controls, which might be considered a kind of a gray area. But we also know about something that is the counterpart, Helmut, to what you have in Europe, the official statement about freedom of science, open science. It's one of these acronyms, NSDD 189, National Security Defense Directive 189, enacted in the Reagan administration, but reaffirmed by subsequent presidential administrations. And what that says is somewhat different from the gray area picture. What that says is that science, fundamental science, is open and the only mechanism for protecting it is classification.
Yep.
And classification, of course, is something that's very well developed in the US, particularly on this panel, a lot of knowledge of what's going on in the Department of Energy national labs, which do classified as well as unclassified research, but also many universities. So Mike, I'm sure that Carnegie Mellon, particularly with respect to export controls, and also with respect to some of these new directives coming out of the agencies to your researchers, you're having to deal now with this this notion that there may be unclassified research which is nonetheless not open. And I wonder if you could comment on that, and then also on some of the other challenges to the that the university faces. The university is the employer of these scientists, and so you're on the hook for making sure that these rules are followed, that landscape is changing. How are universities responding to this?
Yeah, let me walk around the park a little bit. There's a couple of really good questions in there. So I'll speak out of both sides of my mouth. So long ago, you may not believe this, given what I've done the last years, I actually was minted as a high energy physicist, a real experimentalist on international collaborations. And I happened to be at Fermilab when the first collection of Chinese physicists came over as part of an exchange program. It was a remarkable time for us. So the value, I don't want anything I subsequently say to dismiss my support for the value of open collaboration. I do think it's important that the touchstone that we all have in NSDD 189, which said, Philip, as you said two important things. It said there is a presumption that research funded by the US government, there was a presumption that it was open, and when there were sufficient equities that it was not, that there was a well-defined minimal classification scheme. The minimal is my word, but that's my interpretation. I think it's important for us to understand that we live in a very different world than the world in which that was put in place, while there is much that still applies. We lived in a world where despite a Cold War, it was very clear that the United States was operating from a position of leadership, and could afford to say, we are comfortable with open research because a rising tide lifts all boats, but our boat's higher than everybody else. We also were the location for people to come, and we have had, in my opinion, several decades of the world's best foreign talent acquisition program that the world has ever seen. We should not be surprised that in a world today where we have a peer competitor, and depending on where you are on a political spectrum, you can decide if you want to say near peer or you want to say something else, but we have a peer competitor who is in many cases following our playbook. We shouldn't be surprised. The other fundamental difference between now and long ago is the reason a simplified classification scheme worked is because there was very, very much less, I would say the word dual use technology than we have today. But I might turn that a different way and echo some of what Dario said, which is much of the technology base that will define national security in the decades ahead is being driven by the commercial sector first. There's a caveat in there that I'll be a little facetious for a moment, but if anybody thinks we're going to protect artificial intelligence, I'd like to have a long conversation with you. I simply think that's not possible, given the commercial interests that are involved and given the global entities involved. So it's a very different world. And one of the consequences of that is that we have defined a vast collection of new classification and restriction schemes. I would argue that there's a reason for that. So data which is controlled but unclassified, and the universities recognize that, and the universities can find a way to deal with that. I think the bigger problem is that what we have done as an apparatus is we have devolved the definition of how something is classified to the lowest possible level. It is at the program manager level and below. And that's an unworkable situation for people who receive funding from the US government. We have, and Helena knows this from we're not the only person. We have more than one occasion where we have responded to a request from the Department of Energy. We have been awarded a contract to do research, and subsequent to the negotiation and the awarding of the contract, new requirements come on the table about who can work on a program and who can't work on a program, et cetera. And those are not stated policy from the department. They are policy that happens at a low level. That's not a workable solution for us. If our objective is for the lion's share of our work to generate technology that can rapidly be delivered to the market to solve societal problems, and to put in place the restriction mechanisms where those restriction mechanisms really do have to apply. So, what's the situation on university campuses? University campuses are, to Patrick's comment, we are much more enlightened than we were 2 years ago. Universities, by and large, would still like to characterize the problem as an individual research integrity. Bad things. We know how to deal with bad people doing this. Universities remain committed but skeptical, trust but verify, in understanding the scale of what is potentially not an individual problem, but is a country level problem. In other words, state actors operating at a state level, causing things to happen. And Patrick, we've been in enough forums that we continue to talk about the need to scale the actual problem, because the university community in particular has a long history of knowing how to deal with research integrity problems. And if theft of intellectual property or suborning of research or redirecting a research program, those are not unknown things to the university research community. We need to help understand if the problem, where the problem is bigger than that, and we need to scale solutions to that. The last thing I would say is we need to be very careful that the requirements that we place appropriately on restrictions on research for where the research should be restricted, we have to be very careful that those don't become blanket requirements. The cost associated with, an NSF, or I'm sorry, not NSF, it's the designation for the computing, so the controlled computing systems, requiring all universities to abide by those restrictions is I am only going to do open research. And we need to be really careful that these broad-based measures for training and for research security requirements apply only to those things that we are interested in protecting, or only those things where we are interested in making sure that they are not suborned. And I would argue that our starting point for fundamental research has to have an objective of speed of knowledge to the market and speed of product to the market. And the last thing I would say, and I'll reconfirm my commitment to international collaboration, and I will reconfirm my commitment to national security. The last thing I would say is that a policy that says the way I will protect myself is to make sure the other guy fails faster than I do isn't a valid strategy. So throwing sand in the gears so that we all simply slow down or stop doesn't meet the United States interests that are defined by an inextricable combination of national security and economic security. Dario said this before, those are not two separate things. And overclassifying so that we are no longer economically competitive is a problem. Some of you, Helmut may know this, is a very famous dialogue that happened when congressional funding was being appropriated for Fermilab. And in response to a series of questions from the military establishment as to the value of Fermilab, Bob Wilson, who was being pressured to say what military value would come out of the research done at Fermilab, his off-the-cuff answer is, I actually give you something to protect. And I think it's important to understand that the intellectual output of the research community is directly responsible for the economic security of the United States, and that is completely intertwined with the research security.
Thank you for those comments. I want to ask you a follow-up. I want to look at something that you said from the point of view of the scientist, the researcher, or the student. Do you detect a growing unease among your faculty, your students, and your postdocs, possibly that driving some of them to decide that in an environment where some research might be restricted either to them or the people that they might want to hire, in the case of faculty, that they would choose to set up shop somewhere else? That is, it's actually driving problems with recruitment, both of students and faculty.
So I'd say a couple of things. One, our working definition of academic freedom is everybody gets the choice to do something. So Dario will recognize this, having been a CTO at a very large company. My big learning experience when I came to CMU is I couldn't tell anybody to do anything. That's not what I used to do when I was at United Technologies. Now, not clear whether people believe me or not, but I used to be able to tell researchers, this is important to the company, this is what you're supposed to work on. Try that on a campus, doesn't work. So academic freedom, Phil, means people do make choices. It is clearly the case that at a place like Carnegie Mellon, we have a number of people who are willing to operate on all aspects of that spectrum. I do think we are making it hard for people who want to do open foundational research, stuff which is motivated by getting the result out as quickly as possible. We are making it harder for those people by the requirements that we are placing on them. And I think in some cases, people look to say, are there better ways to do that? I don't think it's a huge issue right now. I don't, and I don't know whether Carnegie Mellon is unique or not, but I don't think it's a major issue with people saying, look, I just can't do this anymore. I'm going to go work somewhere else where I think it's going to be easier. I don't see that. And I don't have any evidence that our student population is not coming here we have lots of reasons to be concerned about our international students, but they have more to do with COVID and immigration policy and all that, but not from a sort of research point of view. It does lead me, if I can, I'm just going to put sort of a statistic on the table for just a moment. So the graduate student population, let me say the STEM graduate student population at CMU is 65% international. So to first order, master students away, let's suppose that that's the PhD number, take the professional masters away. To first order, 65% of the research being funded by the US government on campus is being performed by international students, postdocs. It's not immediately clear that the more restrictions we place on those, that there are replaceable people ready to do that work. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that the mechanisms we put in place for control have to work, but they also have to not get in the way of incenting people to come to the United States and stay in the United States.
Let me ask a similar question to Dario, because of course you have labs all over the world, which means that you have a lot of motion. A lot of people can choose where they want to work based on where the work is being done, as well as what the work is. And so I'm wondering whether you're beginning to see any changes in the way the US is viewed as a destination for researchers.
Yes, to some degree, right? I mean, I wouldn't see is overly dramatic, but as a consequence, as Michael was commenting, as a consequence of the increased prosperity of more nations, more sophisticated science and technology environment, and so on over the coming decades, even if they're not making it from a negative perspective of the United States, people choose, right, that they want to conduct their careers in a broader set of opportunities, including their own home countries, Whereas before, we would see a gap that was so significant that acted as a magnet. So we're seeing like sort of like those tide rises. We see a consequence of that. And therefore, for example, international labs, when you say, hey, do you want to come to the United States and move there? Many people say, no, thank you very much. Not because I have anything negative to say about the environment and work in the United States, just because I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing here. Thank you very much around that. So we see that phenomena, and I would say that that's the majority of that phenomena. We have encountered, things, uncertainty with visa issues and, and perception around that there is a small percentage of people that sort of like say, look, this is too hard for me. Or like, there's too much uncertainty around this thing. And therefore, we end up supporting and placing them in other, countries where we have laboratories, which I think is related to your question. And our international presence, it's a relief valve to be able to do that. And sometimes I would say that that's been at a loss of an opportunity to attract, special people. I wouldn't say, it's a catastrophic problem, but it is a problem that the vector is not in the right direction, primarily for the first reason, but the second one doesn't help.
Yes, Helmut, go ahead.
And I should add to that. I would subscribe essentially what I heard from Mike and Dario, but we should not underestimate the problem. I see that we are in a negative slope, what international corporations are concerned, and we must really be very alert. Which climate do we produce for international cooperation for the next generation of scientists? So that's really a concern. I can tell you, so we are, we have a very asymmetric situation. So DESY is actually still inviting successfully young researchers from Poland, from Czech Republic, from Turkey, from Hungary, all countries where freedom of science is under pressure, under serious pressure. So we see, and our young people here in our lab love it, that we are supporting these researchers who live in this very difficult environment. But I can say, so we have difficulties to convince somebody, to go to these places and to do some work. I must say something which you should not take too seriously, but so also we see in the last years, some growing reluctance of our young people to go to the United States. The reason is because they say so this is a place where increasingly science is considered to be one opinion among many. And that's, I only say, so I think there's still, there's not a drop, but you see the slope. And one has to worry about it, and therefore I think we must talk together and at least establish this very, very successful bridge, which we still have, this transatlantic bridge. And we must make sure that this bridge remains stable. And what Dario was saying and Mike about this change we have now, when I was doing in my early day science, I could not understand that I would have a career without being in the United States. This was for me completely impossible. But at that time, the science was very simple. There was classified and unclassified. Now you have this controlled and classified items, which make life very difficult. And I should not, I guess I have seen once, maybe I shouldn't, a huge list of thousands of entries, many thousands of entries, down to a micrometer items, which are on this controlled unclassified item list. I think the name is different. So which makes cooperation so difficult, because there are minute things listed there, which are under severe control by the intelligence agencies and so on, which make our life, but also the life of our next generation, so difficult. And I cannot prove it, but I'm pretty sure if one would do a really a robust vetting of all the entries. Which is it still correct what is there? Then I would say that one would arrive at the list which does not look in the way I have seen it. So we are not talking about that we have now a completely different world, but I see dangerous slopes, and we must really see that the slope gets back into the positive direction. And the future is our next generation, and we have to give trust to the next generation that international cooperation is an asset and not a problem.
You bring up many really serious issues that could occupy panels all day, and particularly the issue of the general trust in science and the attitude of the public towards science and scientists. Unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time. I want to, this is a very important job I have as moderator, to remind the people who are listening in that the Q&A tab on your viewer there is the way to enter questions that will be sifted by the Office of Government Affairs staff that is monitoring us, and we will get an opportunity to talk about some of them openly. And that's time has come. So I'd like to, first of all, invite any of our panelists to please raise your hand and weigh in on any of these questions, and we should just have a discussion for the remainder of this panel on issues that have been brought to our attention by the viewers. So here's the first one. The China initiative had a serious chilling effect on international cooperation, especially with China. How can we rebuild the international scientific ties that were damaged and reduce the climate of fear?
Maybe I can answer, but so there is not, I don't have really the golden key for solving this problem. But I think the one element is we need, in the relations between one country and another country, which is a difficult partner. Lines, cooperation lines, and lines of coordination and communication of trust. So you must find in these places those organizations who you can trust and see that you can build up and or maintain a trustful cooperation. Max Planck in Germany has been doing this for many years and still continue to do this with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where you have, of course, many people in there. They have been in your lab, and so and you can trust it, and you can build up structures again. So this would be one thing. So one needs to build up trustful communication lines in order to not to lose completely another contact with another country.
Yeah, very, very true. I think that's something that we have to not lose sight of. Helena, you, I think, also wanted to comment on this.
I think I will leave comments on the China initiative itself to my DOJ and FBI colleagues. But I would say, on international collaboration, and Rebecca spoke to this earlier, I think it's really important to clarify what is cooperation. Make clear that people understand what's true cooperation. What are the principles behind that? What are the expectations of that? And just in terms of rebuilding scientific ties, reducing the climate of fear, one of the things that, and I'm going to go back to a number of threads that were raised earlier on, how do you think about this gray area? I think Dario, Helmut, they both really talked about identifying the things that we really need to protect and thinking about how we do that in a smart way. But the gray area piece, I think, is really going to be a challenge for us. And that's where I really appreciate this conversation, as well as the various surveys that APS has done of its membership. I think in terms of understanding what the impacts of research security policies have been on the day-to-day of researchers, that is something that we are really looking for, and the sort of data behind that to help us inform how we create these policies and the implementation of them. So I just wanted to put a plug out for the work that APS has been doing in this space, because these reports are really very helpful in that regard.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the shout out. I know that APS works very hard on these as a way to not only provide the information that you need, but also be a sounding board for our community. Mike, you have a comment. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, just a quick comment. I'll tag on what Helena just said. I do think it's sort of rebuilding by baby steps. I think the climate, and Helmut, forgive me, let me make this a US-China cooperation or collaboration. I think the climate right now is not conducive to saying, let's jump into all the gray areas. I think if you start with the starting assumption that we actually do all believe that the most basic science, we actually don't care who knows it. We're here to make something for the world. Those become the basis for collaboration, because that allows you to sidestep the issue of, I have two countries who are diametrically opposed in their economic policies and in their social policies and in their view of the world. And the gray areas are going to drop you right into that. Mm-hmm. Frankly, Phil, I think that's why the physics community gets a nice seat at the table, because there is very, very large elements of basic research for which I can sidestep those other issues. And I think that's where we need to start.
Okay. As I scan the questions that have been asked, they are really, people are focused on people. People are focused on the environment for researchers. So we have a few questions in that general vein. The next one that I'll pose, all these came from our viewers on this panel, leaders at the annual leadership meeting. Has the national security of the US been irrevocably damaged by flawed prosecutions such as that of Professor Gang Chen? That is, have we already lost talented researchers who otherwise would have joined the US STEM effort? Anyone who has any anecdotal knowledge or position on that, I'd be happy to entertain. It's a difficult one, isn't it?
I don't wish to not answer the question, but I think the thing that I think about, and again, I cannot comment on any cases, but the thing that I think about when I think about any of these issues is, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? And the problem, depending on your frame, really can take many different mechanisms. It can be the problem of a competitor nation and the actions of that competitor nation, and it can be much larger, which is, are we trying to attract the best people? Can we retain them? Can we do the best work in the world? And how do we do that? And how do we enable that? And sometimes these questions can really change depending on who is asking them, and the answers can change very much. And so I think that's part of the challenge here. You have NSF and you have DOE on the line here. You have FBI on the line here, and we're all going to bring a very different frame to this question. And when it comes to the larger policy environment, again, you're bringing in 10 other agencies, all with very different perspectives on this. And I think what's going to really help us in this is going to be actual information and data around the real life impacts of these policies. Because I think it's very well and good to cleave to these overarching principles of competition, openness, scientific freedom. But where this challenge is really going to come is where the policy gets made. And that's where having data on this, both on the risks, but also on what the impacts have been, is going to be so important.
Of course, data is very helpful. They tell you about trends, but I think we're all aware that data coupled with anecdotes and individual comments are, just they really help you understand what we're talking about and what are the risks. Here's a question on that sort of thing. The issue of perception of research security policies and the very real impact that the perception has on scientists, particularly early career ones. What should the agencies or our own community, and I think the APS is also on the hook to answer this, what can we do to dispel fear in the community? This is really at the heart of reestablishing a trusting relationship.
So I can start with that one. What I want to emphasize is, of course, we all know that we do need to address issues related to research security. They continue to exist. What we have to do is do it in a measured, analytical way. Sorry, I have a cold. But we also have to work on this together. So I'm going to stop because I'm having a coughing fit. I'm sorry. But we need to somehow get beyond compliance to really understanding that and get back to the basics here. We all agree that transparency is key. The principles themselves are things that we all agree on. And I think we need to get to a point where we work together then on how to make sure we uphold those principles rather than looking like the government is imposing things on the communities. Sorry.
Well, let me, please, it's fine. I think you got your point across very, very well. One of the, there's a follow-on question here that I think will help us. But what you brought up, which I think is so important, which is working together. Of course, the partnerships in the name of the panel. How, as regulatory frameworks are developed, how do the people on the science side, how do the individual scientists, the institutions, organizations like APS, how can we stay informed? How can we provide input, and how can we participate in the decision-making process?
Yeah, I answered this question, but let me also add to your previous question, about, how can we change, the perspective from the young scientists. If you ask young scientists, why did they choose science, or particularly physics, they didn't choose physics in order to influence politics or something. Actually, they want the opposite. They want to stay away from politics. And now, if we are, with every word we say, mixing science with national security, with and all that, and saving the knowledge, which is now should not be spread around. So this is what the young scientist, he did not choose science. He does not get involved. He doesn't get involved in that. So we must really, I'm not advocating a naive scientific picture. I'm not advocating that to get to a naive picture of international cooperation. But if we are, moving in that direction where, everything we do, and, I'm really an advocate that, international cooperation in science is absolutely mandatory. So what do we have internationally? We have CERN, which brings everything together. We have the International Space Station, where, many nations. So, and they are important factors for the world, because people are coming together independent of religion, nationality, and so on. And the young people get to know each other. So it's so important to have international cooperations. So if we are, putting international cooperation in our first reaction on the risk table, I say, this is a bad idea. So I'm not advocating going back to naive things, but we must setting a little bit of priority and to say, so international cooperation is very important. And we also want to work with China in important areas because we need it, so the global threats need cooperation also in science. Can you imagine what is the alternative? So if you say China is developing in some areas with a speed and you see all these numbers, and if somebody have seen this international benchmarking study by DOE, where you see where China is crossing when and where, they say, wow, that's a danger. But what is the alternative that you have a country of that size, of that power, which remains stupid and investing in all kinds of stupid stuff? So that's not the alternative. I think it's good that a country like this is investing in natural sciences, in developing knowledge further. I think it's a good idea, and we have to see that in this positive way. That the politics they do is really extremely difficult, and so nobody likes that, to say the least. But we are talking about science now, and that's a different thing. So I'm really advocating that that we are really making a little bit a clearer language what we want. So one must clarify. US wants cooperation with China. I don't hear that anymore. Yeah. Right? I hear that this is it's a risky thing, and for the next generation, that's a very bad idea, I have to say. But to make this robust, what Rebecca also was saying, all with these measures, reciprocity, and all that, protecting people against data, wrong unintended use of knowledge, and so on. This must all be in place. It should have been in place also 30 years ago, honestly speaking. Yeah. So
I'm sorry to break in, because I think what you're saying is very important and eloquent, and it actually forms a very useful backdrop for the sort of last word with respect to this, that international cooperation is possibly one of the most important elements that our community can provide to help resolve the threat of international security, international research security. Cooperation and communication. And that may be a good place for us to end it. I'd like to thank once again, what a wonderful panel we had today. Rebecca Keiser, Helena Fu, Mike McQuade, Helmut Dosch, and Dario Gil. And also very much thank you, Patrick Shiflett, for helping lead this off. This concludes this panel on partnership in research security, and I'd like to invite all of the people who are attending the meeting and listening in to have a short break now, and to come back at 1:30 for the next panel, which is on countering misinformation. So thanks everybody, and have a great rest of the meeting.